Perfect. Okay, so good morning, everyone. Welcome to the fifth session of the Wetlands in Action webinar series. First, I will introduce myself. My name is Maria Cámara, and I am the communication manager from the REWET project. And today I will be presenting this webinar. If you're new to this webinar, just to let you know that these webinars are jointly organized by the Horizon-funded Europe projects, ALFAwetlands, Restore for Seas, REWET, and Wet Horizons. So far, we've had 4 sessions, which cover topics ranging from greenhouse gases fluxes measurement, also the social aspect of wetland restoration, remote sensing, among other topics. So if you missed this and you're interested in the content, you can actually watch them online. You can find them on the project website and also in ALFAwetlands YouTube channel. And my colleague Irina will later write the link to the playlist. So as you probably know, the main topic of today's session is policy, and we have 5 wonderful speakers today, whom I will introduce later on. So let's go briefly over the webinar rules. So as you're aware from the registration form, this session will be recorded and will be made available for the audience afterwards in the sister projects communication channels. Also, please use the questions and answer box to post your questions and comments. You can do this during the presentation, and then we will open the Q&A session after the presentations are done. And finally, if you have any technical issue, please contact us privately via chat so we can solve this problem. So apart from this Wetlands in Action series, another activity that we're doing is that we created a LinkedIn group on wetland restoration, and this is managed by the communication leaders of each project. So this space is designed as a space for exchange between researchers, practitioners, and other stakeholders working in this field. And if you are interested, you can join us. Joining is automatic, but if you have any issues accessing the group, just let us know and we'll be more than happy to add you. So let's go through the agenda of today. I'm doing the introduction right now. And then we have 4 presentations, 10-minute presentations, followed by a 5-minute Q&A session. Today we have representatives from all sister projects. And then we will do the wrap-up and the next session announcement, and also the final feedback questionnaire. So let's dive in our first talk. Our first speaker is Caspar Verwer. Caspar is an ecologist and senior project leader at the International Union for Conservation of Nature in the Netherlands. He's a former researcher at the Wageningen University and Research Center, where he studied the climate and biodiversity impacts of the loss of the tropical peat swamp forest in Southeast Asia. For IUCNL, he has worked supporting local conservation projects across the globe and is currently also involved in advisory services related to the European Nature Restoration Regulation. So, Caspar, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Maria. And it's my pleasure to share some of the findings from the REWET project related to policies. But first, to start off, this map is to show how badly Europe has been affected by the wetland loss and degradation worldwide since 3 centuries. And as you may know, some countries losing up to 90% of their wetlands. This will ultimately lead or has led to a loss of ecosystem services. And with that, also rising societal costs. So investing in restoration and restoring ecosystems is often much cheaper than managing the damage caused by the degradation. So yes, in fact, we need to invest in restoration and in nature-based solutions. But according to this report, we are by far not reaching or doing what we should do in terms of investing in order to reach the global climate and biodiversity targets or land degradation neutrality targets. Um, so despite there's a lot of initiatives, global initiatives, global support for restoration. Most of these things are not legally binding, and well, so it's a European context. Also, the Green Deal policies, a lot of good things in there that are trying to conserve and restore our natural environment. But we also see a strong and even growing movement of deregulation um, at this moment, actually. So, yeah, the future of these policies, these regulations, is still a bit unsure. We don't know what will happen, but what we know is we need to fight for these policies. So that's really important. What did we do in the REWET project? Apart from measuring greenhouse gas fluxes in 7 different peatlands across Europe, we also looked at the socio-economic and political context of the restoration. So, what have been the main barriers? What have been the main success factors in these countries? And can we identify, based on that, clear pathways to a successful scale up restoration across Europe? Well, in terms of barriers, what we've seen in these different countries is, yeah, there is quite some. Um, to start with, limited or weak national vision and strategy for wetland restoration. Those are some exemptions on this one. For example, the Helmi Habitats program in Finland is a good example of central regulation that works. Well, a lack of legal protection of wetlands in general, dominance of conflicting land uses that often require drainage. There's limited awareness of the benefits still. And also, there's often like a fragmented land ownership situation that hinders or slows down initiatives for large scale restoration. Um, Let me go to this one. Political barriers. No clear quantitative targets for restoration. Well, we hope that in the national restoration plans, of course, this will change and there will be clear, quantitative, spatially explicit targets for restoration of different types of wetlands. We've seen a lack of inclusion of wetlands and hydrology in general in spatial planning, on sectoral policies as well, conflicting or incoherent policies, things, for example, about agricultural subsidies, a lack of political will, priority to restoration, and what I mentioned, of course, this movement of deregulating or simplifying, if you like, existing regulations. And then, in general, poor implementation and enforcement of directives that are there already. Of course, some obvious economic barriers. I'm sure the other speakers will also manage some of these. First of all, the loss of opportunities of doing business as usual if we would re-wet or restore wetlands. So this will affect a large for implementing restoration at scale. It comes also with high costs, investment costs, and at the moment still there's limited markets for example, polluticulture or sustainable business alternatives, which means there's a high financial risk for farmers. And the last one, some social and cultural barriers. On the one hand, strong historical cultural profiling of wetlands as a wasteland. This is what we saw, for example, in Italy, in our case there, Open Lab. But there's also things, for example, the Netherlands, the cultural value of drainage-based models. I think about these landscapes, polder landscapes with old windmills, but it's all based on draining the peatland. So let's dive into the first open lab of REWET. This is an interesting area. It used to be under agriculture, but it has now been included in the buffer zone of a big 10,000 hectare Natura 2000 site, National Park Werebewiede. It's a landscape that was shaped by peat extraction and reed harvesting. And it's actually a very attractive landscape. You see, for example, in this picture, The reeds being used for roofing. It's a still sustainable business model. In this map, you see what happened in terms of re-wetting. So after 95, the area was acquired and then being re-wetted. It's been agricultural lands, so there's a lot of phosphate still in the soil. So what they did in terms of restoration measures was try to reduce the soil nutrients by mowing regime and biomass removal. They also did some water level management, and in the other parts of the buffer zone, they did pit excavation to restore aquatic habitats and sort of reset the succession and transplantation of fen vegetation. It has been pretty successful in this area, and what we also measured is that the overall greenhouse gas emissions reduced. Key obstacles observed were, in the Dutch context, land scarcity. So there's a lot of competition, by other sectors for land. Also, and this is a big issue, political reluctance and weak implementation of the Water Framework Directive. We've seen that the scale for restoration is big because it starts with hydrological restoration, so we need to restore hydrological system, and this would involve many of the stakeholders in the landscape. And this has been going all right in this particular open lab, but it is a challenge, and it's taking time, to do it in a good way. We've also seen that voluntary schemes have been insufficient, and a lack of incentives for nature-friendly farming and, for example, polluter So some of the key success factors: wetter is better. This is what they saw. So it's really the re-wetting has been leading to a return of biodiversity, sequestration of carbon, and an attractive landscape in general, which is being valued by tourists. The large-scale hydrological restoration and buffer zones proved very effective in this case. And also what I mentioned, the cooperation with different stakeholders at landscape scale. Some of the lessons from this open lab was that stronger national regulation, implementation, and enforcement would help a lot. Then it's also smart to align restoration plans with other policies, for example, water safety or climate. And then, still trade-offs would remain. So these things need to be judged on case-by-case basis. So, for example, methane emissions related to re-wetting versus biodiversity gains, aquatic biodiversity in particular, because we saw that ditches still emit methane, but they also contain interesting biodiversity. I think
Sorry, Caspar, we have
yes,
1 more minute. So
one more. Okay, I
yes.
will. Then this is one I mentioned already. Yes. So we had looked at the 7 open lab cases. This is one from Portugal, another one from Finland, and combined the success factors. And what we saw, in this picture depicts different success factors for upscaling. So we see, okay, restoration is non-linear, it's adaptive, it's very context specific, and it will require strong international and national incentives that enable the break with business as usual models. And then wetland degradation, climate change, biodiversity loss must be seen as an integral part of other policies like trade policies, financial policies, energy, water, agriculture, you name it, a lot of these things, spatial planning. So what we did is combine these different success factors into a sort of a theory of change with different pathways. This is the last slide, by the way, Maria. And you can scan the QR code if you like. And this is what we presented as a tool for policymakers, because all the things I just mentioned, the different success factors, the different barriers, they are reflected in this picture. So if you are interested, you can follow the link and read more about how this thing works. And I leave it with that.
Thank you, Caspar, for the presentation and sharing with us the outcomes from the REWET project. We also have, since we didn't have time today to present everything that we have, Irina just shared a link for the policy work done in REWET in our website. And we will also be working on some nice materials in the following months for the policy recommendation for each open lab, so in the context of each country. And Caspar, we have one question from the audience. So the question is, breaking down national regulations on a regional, local level needs a stronger involvement of the municipal level. How is this achieved in the Netherlands?
Yeah, so in this particular case, in the Werebewiede, both provincial and local municipalities have been involved. Um, and because they regularly work together with the water boards, which is another very important stakeholder in this area, especially if you talk about rewetting, of course. So they've been involved in spatial planning and developments, because this area is surrounded by farms, agriculture. So as soon as you start to re-wet, this has impacts, in the surrounding area. So there's a lot of these ditches and very intensive water management, basically. And so these different actors, both the landowners, the farmers, the nature organizations, water boards, but also municipalities and the responsible authority for nature, which is the province, they sit together and discuss possible ways, to reach different targets, not only for biodiversity, but also for water management, water safety, and also agricultural production. The interesting thing, just to add, is that we've been told that a lot of the farmers surrounding the national park are actually willing, to transform, to convert their companies, their farms, to more high water table, crops or other, agricultural things they can do under higher water tables, but that they are still limited to do so in terms of support, the financial backing by local authorities. So that's an interesting one. So that's also an obstacle that the farmers may be willing to do so, but there are still some regulations that hinder them or the lack of financial support.
Thank you. Thank you, Caspar, for all the information provided. I think we don't have more questions in the chat, and we are actually in time. So now we will move on to our second speaker. Yes, Gabriela just asked if they can see the QR code again, but you can actually find it in the link that Irina just shared from the REWET website. You can find the theory of change in there. So if you go directly, you can find it. Okay, so let's move on to our second speaker, Mark Reed. Hi, Mark. Mark
Hello.
is a professor of Rural Entrepreneurship and Research Center Director at the Scotland Rural College, and he's also a visiting professor at the University of Leeds and Birmingham City University. Mark is the research lead for the International Union for Conservation of Nature from the United Kingdom peatland program, and also co-chair of the UNEP Global Peatland Initiative Research Working Group. He has advisory roles across the UK governments on just transition, natural capital investments, and peatlands. He has experience creating and running voluntary carbon markets as the original architect of the Peatland Code, and also a lead author for the Shod Marsh Code and the British Standards Institute Carbon Standard. So, Mark, please go ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you, Maria, and a pleasure to be with you all. I'm going to be sharing some of the findings and focusing primarily on the policy recommendations from EU scale to national scale from the Wet Horizons project. This is work emerging from the work that we've been doing with Scotland's Rural College and Wetlands International with their Europe office based in Brussels as well. Uh, and essentially, what we're trying to understand here is how we can complement public funding for peatland restoration with private finance in a way that enables us to scale peatlands and other forms of wetland restoration without putting additional burden on public finances, given how expensive this is. Whilst also coming up with solutions for the private sector. Many companies are getting products from peatlands which are hugely carbon intensive. And as they try to reach their Scope 3 emissions targets, they need options to try and reduce the emissions from these peatland agricultural sites. And markets, whether it's carbon, biodiversity, water, other nature markets like this, could be an option. But there are problems. There are problems with market integrity. There are problems with greenwashing, people making claims they shouldn't, or using markets when they haven't done everything they can to reduce their emissions at source. But even if we can overcome those problems, there are still financial, practical, cultural barriers. That means that the landowners who would need to restore those sites are still reluctant to engage with these schemes. And even if we can overcome those barriers, we tend to forget the local communities and others who are affected by these projects, which undermines the legitimacy of what we're doing and the social license of these markets and policies. So there is now an exciting policy window opening. And this is not about saying we can put in less public money. It's about saying we can maybe do some clever things with the private finance, especially given opportunities around the nature restoration regulation, which we'll be hearing much more from Jan Peters in a moment, and the nature credits roadmap, the carbon reduction certification framework linked to that, and new opportunities around the common agricultural policy that together could give us policy levers that we could pull to make substantial changes that could really stimulate restoration at scale. So, 6 key research findings. I'll spend a bit more time on the recommendations to conclude. But to give you a flavour of this, the research shows that when high integrity, these kinds of markets can indeed scale restoration without putting a major additional burden on taxpayers. And it is carefully designed blended finance initiatives that are able to do this because we're now using public funding not just to pay for restoration, but to de-risk opportunities for investors to make this a lower risk, higher yield opportunity for investors. So we crowd in more investment funding and also mechanisms that make taking that investment lower risk for landowners. So the result is we get more funding and more adoption, hence more restoration. There are, though, criticisms that what we're doing is just making the rich landowners richer. And we need to balance these carrots with sticks. And so, for example, in Scotland, there are considerations and in Denmark plans for a land emissions carbon tax. And in the UK, we've explored the possibility of integrating peatland carbon projects into the UK's emissions trading scheme, which effectively turns now a peatland estate or farm into a pollution source and invokes a polluter pays principle. But as I've discussed, the way in which we design these markets has a strong impact on adoption. So we need to design these markets in ways that are high integrity, but that are also attractive enough for landowners to engage with, We need to design them in a way that means that the companies investing can make the kind of claims that will be of value to them and their investors. And we need to also pay attention to the subsidies that sit in between all of this, that if not appropriately designed, rather than leveraging and crowding in private investment, in fact, they can crowd it out because those markets are no longer additional. People would have done it anyway for the subsidies. So a lot of thought needs to go into the design, but it can be done. The restoration work that we're doing, we tend to think about this in terms of carbon offsets, but there is a growing need to get control of these Scope 3 emissions for companies, especially that are deriving products from lowland peats that don't look like peatlands anymore, but are actually losing huge amounts of carbon. And taking these lands out of production is not an option economically for most landowners, for most countries. Polludiculture could be an answer for some areas. For other areas, perhaps this is about retaining the existing production system, but raising water tables to reduce emissions. And perhaps whether this is about about reducing emissions from the current practice or polludiculture, we could also put in biochar. So we're now neutralizing and maybe even turning these into carbon stores once again. But the whole time we have to pay attention to the fact that, yes, we need to get the market right, both supply and demand side, and we need to pay attention to the landowners. Without any of that, we have nothing. But if we also do not pay attention to engaging appropriately with marginalized, vulnerable groups, communities in particular, and giving some kind of benefit back to these, then we have projects that don't have social license, that are not legitimate, that ultimately become opposed by everyone else who benefits from these landscapes. So very briefly, I'll spend more time on my final two slides. We often think about integrity as being all about the environment. And yes, that's part of this. The CRCF is going to give us minimum requirements for environmental integrity. But my hope is that we can go way above that. And so I think there's going to be an increasing role for ratings agencies to tell us the kind of schemes that actually give you the highest integrity versus the bare minimum integrity once we've got this working and introduced. I've spoken about honest claims, about blended finance, about community benefit. But we need to also pay attention to the social science of how farmers make decisions, because this is not simply a risk-reward function. Yes, farmers are attentive to risk. Yes, they need sufficient reward. But there are cultural practices, ways of thinking, informal norms and rules of thumb that are actually often just as important. So, two slides of recommendations. First of all, if I can go to the EU level. Usefully, the CRCF has three different ways in which you can generate carbon reductions, and this includes carbon farming, and within carbon farming we have peatland restoration. It can include salt marsh restoration, etc. But we need much clearer guidance on what high integrity looks like. Because, yeah, it's very hard to measure, and especially to measure accurately in a way that is both accurate and cost effective enough in a market context. We need to think much more clearly about how nature restoration plans, which we're hearing more about in a moment, can crowd in private finance in a way which is not just taking the money, but doing so within very clear frameworks that integrate with public funding rather than conflicting. We need to tighten the rules around environmental claims. So we have a very useful initiative, the Voluntary Carbon Market Initiative, VCMI, and their claims code, but it's voluntary. And currently only the largest companies are actually investing the money to prove that they have indeed done everything they can to reduce emissions at source. And they are only offsetting residual emissions. So we need more national piloting of this, and there is the potential for this to be built into the EU framework. But bearing in mind, it takes money to actually do all of the third-party auditing to prove that these companies are doing the right thing, and we need to think about that as well, and not allow this to only be for the largest companies. As I said, there are lots of increasingly credible options to reduce peatland emissions within a value chain, so insetting instead of offsetting. But there's a real problem around the integrity of this. All of the focus has been on getting the integrity of offset markets right. And there's a lot of black box models and hand waving that nobody's really paying attention to in the insetting world. So in addition to the credibility of the options that can decarbonize peatland agriculture, we also need to pay attention to the credibility of these in terms of their measurement, reporting, verification, additionality, and the like. We've talked about the kind of blended finance tools that you can introduce. We can do these at the EU level. We can also start to save money by doing some of that measurement, reporting, and verification at EU level. In Scotland, we've just piloted a carbon contracts measure where a certain proportion of the carbon units from a project are bought by government, guaranteed at a fixed price. There are more sophisticated options. You can look at carbon floor price guarantees. So we guarantee you'll get a certain minimum. And if you get more than that, great, you can take the profit. Or a contract for difference approach, where if the carbon market is lower than that set price, we'll still pay you that set price. Don't worry. But if it goes higher, then the government pockets the profit. So lots of different ways that you can do this that we need to think about, and certain governments within Europe already doing that thinking. We need to learn from that and ask what we could do at this broader scale. And in terms of price signals, I've mentioned emissions, land emissions, carbon taxes, emissions trading schemes. I think these are things that can be considered beyond the national scale. But at that national scale, I think one of the key missing parts.
Sorry, we have 1 more minute.
Okay,
Sorry.
One of the key missing parts of the puzzle here is that many companies are reliant on international voluntary carbon markets run by the likes of Verwer, Gold Standard, and the like. We did work on peatland carbon and on salt marsh carbon in the UK, concluded that these schemes are too expensive. They're run by for-profit organisations, and they don't always have the integrity we want, which is why we have now domestic carbon markets for peatlands, woodlands, salt marsh we're just bringing online. And I think that we need to think about those domestic market opportunities across Europe. We've already talked about the need to make sure incentives line up. And we need to not only think about how we stack public and private, but how we stack with true integrity carbon and biodiversity or water, or peatland carbon plus biochar carbon, and make sure that we keep the additionality good. I think it's important to consider what we can do in terms of advice, transition support, demonstration. This stuff is not easy. This is not how farmers have typically worked in the past. And we need to think about more meaningful ways of engaging communities and bringing them benefit. My message is that we can scale this with integrity and legitimacy. And we have many things we can do, both at national scales and at EU scales. This is possible, but we need to pay attention to the evidence and we need to learn between countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, for the presentation. Very nice overview and recommendations for high integrity peatland restoration financing. So we have actually a couple questions in the chat for you. So we have a question from Vanessa Sanchez. She's asking, how long will take the European Commission to have ready the nature credits markets from a regulation point of view, and which should be the drivers from a policy point of view to create demand from private companies?
Yeah, okay, good. So I don't have visibility to the internal machinations of the European Commission on this particular policy. If there are others on the call who do, please feel free to answer the question on timing. In terms of drivers from that policy point of view, it's, as I was saying, a balance between sticks and carrots. This is about creating an environment where it's easy to invest, where we are de-risking investment, given that these are much longer term time horizons, over which many companies might be used to investing, and there are new, unknown, and quite unpredictable risks. So that's the carrot side. In terms of the stick side of this, I've talked about emissions trading schemes and inland emissions carbon taxes. That's very specifically focused on companies that own peatlands that are emitting. But there are many things that we can do. For example, in the UK, we have the Companies Act that requires companies to report based on the Task Force on Climate-related disclosures. That could be extended to the Task Force on Nature-related disclosures, requiring people to report on our emissions. And for me, that is actually the most valuable thing that we can do, because the real pressure, in my experience of working with these big multinationals, is in fact coming from their investors. And I've worked with CEOs who don't even believe that climate change is real, but they are doing incredibly good work because that's what they have to do as CEO to keep their investors happy.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. So we have a couple more questions, but we are running out of time. So thank you, Mark, for all your insights and experience. So we will move on to our third talk. In this talk, we have two speakers. So let me introduce you to Jan Peters and Emmi Haltia from ALFAwetlands. Jan is a landscape ecologist by training and managing director at the Michael Succo Foundation, partner in the Wierswald Meyer Center. His work focuses on peatlands and climate change with main expertise on policy analysis. He also holds experience in international projects on climate change mitigation and adaptation, and also biodiversity conservation connected to peatlands in Europe, Asia, Africa, and South America. Additionally, he's the chair of the board of the Wetlands International European Association. Then we have Emmi Haltia. She's a senior scientist at the Natural Resources Institute in Finland. She holds a PhD in forest economics and belongs to the research group Bioeconomy Policies and Markets. She has experience in forest owner behavior, forest policy, landowners' compensation requests for producing ecosystem services, and behavioral economics. Besides Jan and Emmi, Marie Lorenz, also from the Michael Succo Foundation, is a co-author of this presentation. So Jan, Emmi, whenever you want, you can start.
Yeah, thank you very much, Maria, for this warm introduction. I hope you can see my slides now. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, as Maria already introduced, we will give a shared presentation from the ALFAwetlands project on nature restoration regulation, as Mark already indicated. And we will talk a little bit about the political mandate for the restoration of wetlands in Europe, on knowledge, barriers, and enablers. So I would like to start with a short recap on the nature restoration regulation. Then we will talk about knowledge. We will talk about the barriers, legal, but also socio-economic. We will have presented by Emmi a stakeholder analysis on wetland restoration with a landowner and citizen survey. And we will also share some nice example from enablers in this field. So a short recap of the nature restoration regulation in a nutshell. It entered into force in 2024 after long discussions, negotiations between the co-legislators on the EU level, and finally approved by the European Council. And it's the first law with binding restoration targets, which are to restore 20% of all land and sea by 2030 in the EU. And restore all degraded ecosystems by 2050. So actually an ambitious long-term target. And it will also prioritize ecosystems with high climate and biodiversity value. So the co-benefits are clearly mentioned there. And these include wetlands, peatlands, rivers, and coastal systems. So the ones we are working with in our Horizon projects jointly. And as most of you know, member states have to submit their national restoration plans by September this year. Now, I want to talk about specifically peatlands in the EU restoration law. So on one hand, peatlands, also other wetland types are, of course, included in the Article 4.1, which is on restoration of habitats. So there, the habitat types of the EU Habitat Directive are listed, and there's a priority to restore them. But additionally, there is under the Article 11.4, a specific paragraph on peatlands under agricultural use, which are actually in many countries, as we will see soon, some of the most degraded ecosystems we have. So there are specific targets for that to be reached: 30 by 30, 40 by 40, and 50 by 50 restored, but with like slightly different rules for rewetting. And paludiculture, which was also mentioned before in some of the presentation, is clearly recognized as one of the restoration measures. So restoration doesn't mean to stop agriculture and land use on these sites, but it actually encouraged to switch to more sustainable biodiversity and climate-friendly agriculture. Also, other activities like peat extraction, forestry, and so on, restoration on these sites count towards the targets. And very nicely summarized by another Horizon project, by the Merlin project, in a publication from 2030, it shows that the nature restoration regulation is actually very well situated within the context of EU legal framework. So it's not standing alone, but it's very much embedded into already existing legislation like the Habitat Bird Directive, like Water Framework Directive, like also the climate laws. And there are a lot of co-benefits to reach these targets and also contributing to other targets. Within ALFAwetlands, we summarized what the peatland targets under Article 11.4, which I just presented, actually mean. And we published that in an ALFAwetland policy brief last year. And here you can see one of the graphs from that, which shows the green bar shows the total peatland area under agricultural use in the countries. So only for agricultural use drained. And the yellow, orange, and red bars show the 2030, 2040, 2050 goals. And you can already see here that, Germany by far is the country with the highest obligation to restore peatlands, actually quite some substantial areas, followed by Poland, and quite surprisingly by Romania, which many countries don't have so much on the list of peatland-rich countries. And then also followed by, many countries in Northern and Western Europe, like Netherlands, Ireland, but also like Finland and Scandinavian and Baltic countries. So there is definitely like shared responsibilities among EU member states. And we also showed that within the policy brief for different countries. For example, these are the analysis of the hectares which needs to be reached by these obligations in Germany. And we showed on this little graph, we see that actually, for illustration, for visual means, we put it over Berlin. And you see that actually the restoration goal to 2050 covers includes a rewetting far more than the area of the city of Berlin, of our capital. So this you can find within the policy brief, which nicely shows what the obligations and the targets of the nature restoration law actually means for the countries. And we have a broad knowledge base. We have a strong scientific foundation for well understood wetland ecology, also brought by all the different Horizon projects. Proven restoration techniques and a clear nature-based solutions framework. All this is very nicely also compiled within the Biodiversity Information System for Europe by European Environmental Agency. We have a lot of advances in the last years. For example, spatial mapping monitoring tools like the European Wetlands Map, which you can see here, which was developed by ALFAwetlands, but also Wet Horizon project. We are currently developing a decision support system for stakeholders to get engaged in wetland restoration and to integrate socio-ecological data for stakeholder engagement. We will hear more about that later. But there are also still a lot of knowledge gaps, actually, like long-term restoration impacts, site-specific effectiveness of restoration measures, how we scale up from pilot to landscape level, which is definitely needed to fulfill the targets, and also the socio-economic trade-offs of wetland restoration. So we have a lot of challenges and barriers there. Many of them had been listed already by the previous presenters. That's why I don't want to go much more into detail, but it's very much connected, of course, with fragmented laws like counteracting legislation, land use property rights, also quite a lot of administrative burden, and also like misalignment of subsidies, like from the Common Agricultural Policy, for example. But I won't go much into detail because we have a very nice, interesting survey, which has been taken within the ALFAwetlands project, especially by Emmi and from Lucas. So I would like to hand over to her for the next slides here.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I very briefly present some first results of our surveys. So we collected 2 large-scale survey datasets within ALFAwetlands project. So we surveyed almost 5,000 citizens and over 2,000 landowners across 6 countries, mainly the same, but small differences. The online surveys were distributed by polling company Villanueva, and for landowners there was this screening questions about if they own land or manage land owned by someone else. So for example, agricultural, forestry, or idle land, at least 1 hectare. We're still examining the representativeness of especially the landowner data, and thus these results that I will present are still preliminary, and there might be slight changes, but probably not many anyway. And both surveys had questions, for example, about the attitudes and knowledge about restoration, and from landowner surveys about willingness to collaborate with other landowners. And in addition, in the citizen survey, we had the questions about citizens' willingness to pay for wetland restoration program, and in landowner survey about their willingness to accept compensation for wetland restoration activities. So next slide, please. Yes, so here we look at whether people think that the restoration is necessary and beneficial. So the citizens' results are shown in the blue bars and landowners in red bars. And across most of the countries, there are clear majorities of both citizens and landowners who agreed with these statements. And these are percentages of respondents who agree or somewhat agree with the statement in the 5-point Likert scale. Agreement is particularly high in countries like Austria, Spain, Germany, and somewhat lower but still substantial in other countries. We're still looking at the reasons for the Latvian results for the beneficial wetland restorations beneficial, and we'll have some ideas on that later. And from these results, what is striking is that landowners' views in these quite general attitude questions are broadly aligned with the citizens' views, so there are quite small differences in these 2 data sets. And so this suggests that skepticism towards restoration is not about rejecting its benefits per se, but more about how restoration is implemented, which becomes quite clear in the next slides. So the next ones, please. So this one is about the landowners' perceived barriers for wetland restoration. We had this open question in the end of the landowner survey. So if you wish, you may add any to your answer or share your thoughts on restoration. And here we have analyzed the open responses and recognized barriers and enablers. from these responses. And among the barriers, landowners raise largely economic and institutional barriers, not ecological. So high costs, income loss, and loss of flexibility in land use are central concerns. So many respondents also mention bureaucracy and fear of permanent restrictions. And there is also a clear signal of limited trust, including concerns about ideological pressure rather than pragmatic problem solving. So next slide, please. And here are the enablers what landowners mentioned in their responses. So at the same time, they were quite explicit in these things that we can classify as enablers. So first, participation needs to be voluntary and respect property rights. Second, compensations must be fair, predictable, and cover both costs and income losses. And third, landowners strongly prefer local, site-specific solutions rather than one-size-fits-all policies. And finally, so the trust-based cooperation, clear science-based information and practical support from authorities and experts are seen as key enablers. So overall, the message based on these survey questions is quite clear. So there is support for restoration, but scaling up depends on credible governance, trust, and economically realistic incentive structures. Now, Jan, you can continue from this.
Yeah, thank you very much, Emmi, for these results. And we have some breaking news actually from last week, only last Friday. Germany announced a new funding scheme for peatland restoration, including paludiculture establishment in Germany. And you have seen from the graph in the beginning that Germany actually has like a lot to do in this field. It has the highest obligations from nature restoration regulation to restore agricultural peatlands. So they actually released a major enabler. We see it as a game changer, which includes 1.75 billion euros, which will be spent till 2029 from the Federal Action Plan on Nature-Based Solutions for Climate and Biodiversity. So these are solely national funds, which had been notified last week by the European Commission, because they are like also working on agricultural land, which receives CAP funding as well, but this is approved, and this is also clearly earmarked as funding for implementation of nature restoration regulation, Article 11.4, but also LULUCF climate regulation, where peatlands also play a major role within German emission reporting. So this is really a big game changer, and it would be great if we see other EU member states to follow this example. And that's all from our side, from Emmi and my side. Thank you very much for your attention, and we are looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Jan and Emmi, for your presentation. And yes, we hope to see new funding schemes such as the one in Germany in other countries in Europe. So for the questions, I have one for Emmi. What are the next steps in your survey analysis?
Thank you. So we are still working on some like basic results that will be published in the ALFAwetlands deliverables in the coming months, and then we are working on with this, especially in the citizen survey, with this willingness to pay questions, and because there was this choice experiment question format there in the survey. And we are able to analyze the different citizen groups and their attitudes and values and such that have impact on their willingness to support the restoration program that was designed to be quite closely, that was thought to be the nature restoration regulation then, like the little bit over a year ago when the survey was conducted. And now for the landowner survey, we are working on these compensation request questions, and hopefully later this year we will see interesting results on those.
That sounds very interesting, and we'll be looking forward to see the results, hopefully in a paper or in the deliverable that you will deliver. So I think there are no more questions. Thank you, Jan and Emmi, again for your presentation. Let's move on to our last speaker of today. So our last speaker is Maria del Mar Otero. She's a senior specialist in nature-based solutions and marine conservation at the European Topic Center at the University of Malaga. As a coastal and marine expert, she works on several international national projects and initiatives across the the Mediterranean, the European Union, and Asia, generating and facilitating knowledge transfer and capacity building. She also delivers policy outreach on topics such as adaptation to and mitigation of climate change, coastal wetlands, and marine biodiversity. So please, Mark, you can go ahead.
Thank you very much. And good morning, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. Please confirm with me when the screen is shared, so you can see. Can you see it?
Yes, but not in full mode. No. Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So good morning, everyone. Well, and thank you very much for allowing me to participate on this super interesting meeting. I think each of us is coming with a different angle, but also very complementary. So I hope through this presentation feel a little bit another aspects that you have not seen today, but also help us to continue on how to make this moving from policy to practice for wetlands. This is the presentation from Restore for Seas, and with me has been many different partners. So I would like to acknowledge all the project partners that participate, including my colleagues from Ecologic that has been the leaders of the policy part as well. So just to say that the way how we analyze and we're looking into this is through the coastal wetlands loop. Because we understood that that was a little bit of a gap that still needed to assess and looking into there. So what we did was to analyze the extent on which different nationals and international policies at the EU level looking at coastal wetlands, identify those needs, information, methods, and tools that could be used. What could be the insights that will come up from this experience and this look, and also trying to develop some kind of guidance for national implementation. Also, given what the colleagues also integrated before and mentioned, like the National Restoration Law, but also some of the other measures and policies that are up there to take and use the opportunity. So for this, we have different strategies, and some of them quite similar to the ones that we've seen. But as I say, looking at on this loop context of the national interface, on the land sea interface, marine interface, and also we also did the end users need assessment more at the level of the national implementation as well. Develops an indicator framework that we'll be showing in a little bit, policy brief and implementation roadmap. That is the last part that I think will be perhaps one of the most interesting part for you to see now. So similar to the other colleagues, we were looking at those international policy as we were seeing also the marine part. We also looking at the regional sea conventions also, and also the marine directive as well, and other policies that at level of the country level help us to see what the countries were doing to implement some kind of coastal wetlands conservation and restoration actions, and how they will put it out. Because what we wanted to see, what lessons learned, but also wanted to see what opportunities were used, and if they were, and where the challenge and the enables that could be happening there. So going to this very similar to the other colleagues. There were these ambitious targets, this some of the lack quantitative targets that we still, as Caspar was mentioning in the first intervention, that was finding there, and also the opportunities that were coming into different, for the explicitly referring to the coastal wetlands itself. Some of them not seen yet because there were many times focused on the very land wetlands, but less on the land-sea interface. So one of the things, just to go a little bit more on the takeaways of these messages, for example, that we didn't see a coastal wetland definition on many of the countries, on many of the policies. That also create a problem when we are reporting, and the countries were reporting how we advance on progress as well. So there was the definition, also the extent and the boundaries we look at normally were subject to different interpretation by the countries. And that also create a little bit of a problem on how it is moving. To tracking progress on targets, also the wetland status also lack, because of the previous part, also lack of uniform metric and indicator to measure this restoration or conservation targets. And sometimes when we look at, because our project also was linking also on the climate change part, the part on the climate change mitigation and adaptation was also missing, still there. But there were some good practices that we see, and we are coming out with some of these good practice on developing some of the strategies by building national strategies or sub-regional strategies for biodiversity, where they put specific targets for wetland restoration, some of them for wetlands itself, wetland strategies itself. We're seeing also some specific targets within them. And there's some countries where they're doing these area-based targets or restricted protection targets regarding protected areas that also help on this. We've seen also the part on the funding that our colleagues was mentioning in Germany, and also the countries are moving a little bit more into this. Spain also have a big investment right now on this part, and also, and I think it's important to prioritize what areas to be looking at when interventions have to be done. And as Mark was also saying, there is also some volunteer mechanisms for coastal wetlands offsetting projects that have been developed in some of the regions. Now is the question to see the implementation of them. Some of them that are just started to be implemented, and see how they are, the lessons learned that we go along these pilot stages for the coastal environment and the coastal wetlands itself. So much of the policy brief, we have policy brief developed in the project and has been across different contexts, and where we thought that was important coming out. They're all in our website and translated in different languages. So maybe you can use them and trying to see if that will be helpful for any work that you are developing. Some of them are related to national restoration plans or social acceptability, but very much follow some of the context on there. But also there are other ones just to try to provide a snapshot of the European Coastal Wetland Assessment that we've done, or the indicators for policy, for example. And this is one of the things that we wanted to give you a little bit of the context that can be applicable. We mention it in the way of coastal wetlands, but it could be applicable on how we are seeing the progress of the European policies in terms of all these synergies on the different international and European and national implementation of wetlands, and we develop a kind of policy framework and indicators that looking at how wetlands or coastal wetlands are representative on these targets, and how we can monitor them in terms of the protections and restricted protection, representative of different habitats, improving of coastal health, restoration rate, or greenhouse emission abatement as well, or vulnerability to climate change disasters, or even the zero of agriculture area that just previously mentioned as well, and overall funding sources for coastal wetlands or wetlands in general. So in the way that they can help us to see how we are moving into the future. We also developed a platform that the origin of this platform aimed to provide a snapshot for each of the countries where coastal wetlands were, and it's available in the website that is there with a data catalog and different interactive tools that can be used in the next part that will show you. But they are there for sort of be used and to look at and track the time of how wetlands are in different contexts, in the proportion of the country, in the proportion of the protection, on the actions on restoration, and so forth. For example, here we also integrated the policy progress tracking tool just to understand how wetlands are in that level and how countries can be used and we can overall have a look on how wetlands are at the European level, but also countries can be started to look different metrics and see how bring some of the elements that they are doing on different contexts and policies and implementation planning into there. But the idea of the tracking tool also was to also provide this assessment on how coastal wetlands were. We did this assessment at the European level. That was the first time that this assessment has been done in more detail. And trying to see what were the major drivers and the core indicators that help us to understand and how the trends on this. And you can see, for example, some of the trends at the level of the European level on the physical state, or for example, on the structural state of the conservation of the coastal wetlands are still deteriorating, and some other ones are still unknown. And this is also a very important part because in many of the directives and the regulations and implementations, there is no monitoring frameworks there to see how the wetlands are there. So that is also a part of the message that we need to continue in order to see how the policy is involved and evolving on the data gaps that we need to understand how well we're doing in there. And the last part that I wanted to comment it to you as well is that we develop a kind of a roadmap on how, as a kind of guide for national or sub-regional authorities or stakeholders involved in preparing national restoration actions, whether there's the restoration plans or whether it's the biodiversity plans where coastal wetlands could be incorporated, or also other ones, but integrating different frameworks and policies that there are the opportunities in there. And this is a very hands-on developing guideline that aims to provide also some pathway that also link to the theory of change that our colleagues say. Look at all these elements as well and develop this kind of blueprint. The way how we done it is also to define priorities and to address questions specifically to different elements in a way that we are looking at baseline assessment first, where you are and where the country is in terms of knowledge of defining the wetlands itself, defining the coastal areas, defining the policies that they have implemented, how in these policies this is appear or not appear, what is the targets or no targets. And from there, looking at, for example, the operational targets for them, how we prioritize activities and actions. And based on this also, for example, if there is any different type of habitats that need to interpretation or integration, what is the monitoring that is there, what kind of indicators can be used to monitoring these targets on these operational parts, for the plan of the restoration itself. And which sites have been lost and could be implemented as well, and helping to restore and prepare some restoration activity that also integrate things like greenhouse gases and social acceptability, obviously, and also different kind of blending findings, as our colleagues were saying as well. Also with this, with transversal aspects like policy integration, the good governance and stakeholder participation, public and private partnerships as much as possible. In the coastal environment, this is a bit more challenged because many times the coastal environment is a national ownership, as we saw in the last also comment from the colleagues on the questionnaire that they were doing as well. So the ownership that also affect on the participation and the type of partnership, how this could be done, and also in the naval capacities and increase awareness on there. And also this is also developing different stepwise. As for the sake of time, maybe I will not go into that level of the details, but you can see it in the guidelines on how we develop with these different type of questions and how to select the different criteria for restoration, for defining restoration techniques, develop the metric, the policy metrics, indicators, monitoring, and bringing some type of funding sources, and also the opportunities that we use from the work that we did. Because as we say, we have this decision, we have this platform that can also help you to, if you don't have the information on the coastal wetlands in your area, that can be used to download and to take part. Also, we have decision support tools, for example, for looking at potential wetlands areas that could be restored. So you can have a prioritization of areas where you can start your stakeholder discussions. And this is based, for example, on the lost wetlands and the opportunities with land use at the moment, and also the conservation status of different sites, to trying to provide a kind of preliminary step where you can bring some of the discussions points, and also looking at also if the areas are protected or no, for example. So the idea is that you can use also these parts, and also we implement this in two areas to build these roadmaps in Romania and Portugal, also available for you to see how we use this work to start prioritizing items that were mostly needed attention, bringing some recommendations regarding knowledge base, and also to have this discussion at the level of the countries where this planning is developed. The important part is that we wanted to integrate the opportunity, that also the biodiversity, the strategies, the protection goals, the climate change, the LULUCF, and many of the policies are talking about, but putting it together in a more roadmap for integrating many different aspects in there. And as our final recommendations from this work, obviously, as the colleagues say that we have big implementation challenges, as we say. The definition is one of the ones that also perhaps is one of the most tricky challenges that still some of the countries still need to develop on there in the national legislation, and maybe at the level of the EU to get up, because that will help us to unify and to see how progress we are looking at, and to establish also the national baseline and how we are developing the knowledge and the monitoring for this, and also having a more high impact restoration zones that help us to integrate also this land-sea interface, and also different aspects to make climate change from the part in adaptation and mitigation, and also activate this part of stakeholder engagements and public awareness that we need so much, and our colleagues were also mentioned. So for me, this is all. I wanted to, maybe I went too fast, maybe I went too slowly, but I wanted to be sure that we have enough time and do not repeat too much. And if there's any question, just let me know. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mar, for your presentation. There's a lot of interest in all the resources that we've been sharing from all presentations. So I hope that we are sharing all the links that the people are interested in. Also, to let you know, to the participants, that we will be sharing also today's presentation in PDF format, so you can take a look slowly in your office and read it throughout. And there are no questions in the chat, so I will go ahead and give Irina the floor to go over the final feedback questionnaire. So, Irina.
Yes, thank you, Maria. And using this opportunity, I would also like to thank to all our speakers. They found time to join this webinar and to make it another joint event. And for our participants, I would also like to thank you for all your information you provided during registration. It is processed by our experts, and we will include it into our follow-up policy work. But we also understand that this short event is not able to cover all the aspects, all the challenges, all the questions you have. And that is why we would like to ask you to fill out our final survey. I will share a link now. It will also appear on your screen when the webinar is finished, and we will also follow up with the email. So it's really important if you find time to answer to these questions regarding this webinar and regarding what we should include into our further policy work. So thank you, and please take some time to be connected with us further on and also to help us to shape other events which we are still planning to conduct. Thank you.
Thank you, Irina. So in that sense, we actually will have our last Wetlands in Action webinar, which will be held in May 6th, so in a couple of weeks. So this will be our last session, and it will cover tools for climate resilient wetland restoration. So we hope to see you there from 10 to 11:30. Irina just shared the registration link here in the chat. So if you're interested in this topic, we really look forward to see you there. And I just wanted to take also the opportunity to thank all our wonderful speakers for taking the time to be with us today and sharing all the results and insights about this important topic. And thank you also to my colleagues from the sister projects for working so hard to organize this event. And we hope also to see you on the LinkedIn Wetland Restoration Group. You're encouraged to post and stimulate the discussion around the topic. So that's it from my side. Thank you to the participants for also being with us today. So I think we are done for today. Thank you all for being here, and we hope to see you in our next session. Thank you.